Greetings, welcome to the Metal Book Tavern. One fact about me: English is not my first language. I'm a native Russian speaker. I suppose that there are a lot of people who, like me, don't speak English as their first language, but they really want to read a lot of books in English. Not the adapted versions, but the originals. And if you are that person, this video is definitely for you. And even if you aren't, even if English is your native language, this video is also for you. Or this could offer a different perspective on things for you. I have been actively reading in English since 2020. Sure, I read in English before, but let's pretend that books before 2020 they didn't exist. Here are my tips to reading books in English. So my very first tip is to determine your English level. So there are 6 levels of English, from A1 beginner to C2 advanced. Before you select a book, you definitely should know your English level. There are multiple online tests on the internet and you can take it and test your English skills. Well, the last time I checked, my English level was B2. Maybe it's going to be much higher now, I don't know. Anyway, it's better to know your English level first. So my next advice is, prior to reading books, try reading articles. Yes, before I started reading a lot in English, I mean the books, I read a lot of articles in English, and those articles, they helped me memorize some words. For example, when I was reading A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, I heard that it had a lot of judicial language. When I began reading it, I faced no problem. I always say when I talk about A Good Girl's Guide to Murder is that I'm thankful to articles about celebrities who had trouble with the law. Yes, there used to be a time when I read a lot of articles about them, but you don't have to read articles about celebrities who had trouble with the law. You can read articles about other things. Usually reading articles is easier than reading books. So my next advice is, when you see an unfamiliar word, don't rush to the online translator. I'm sure that this word is going to appear in the book multiple times. Well, for example, when I was reading Tolkien in English, the 3 words that I often saw in his writing were thrall, malice and peril. And I memorized them all. And only after I encountered them multiple times in the text, I went to the online translator and only then I remembered what they meant. Related to the previous advice, pay attention to the context in which the word is described in. Yes, definitely context matters. And if you understand the context, you would understand the word too. My next advice is related to the first one. Avoid books where there are too many words you would need to translate. This was the mistake that I made when I was reading Fever Dream by George R.R. Martin. I really wanted to read that book, although in my defense I didn't find the Russian version yet, and I had to translate nearly every word. The deal is that George R.R. Martin really likes to describe things. When, for example, if a character enters a room, Martin is going to describe how the room looks. And he likes to describe food. And it's definitely going to be harder for a reader, especially when all these descriptions, they come from the first pages. It's one thing if you have to translate a few words, but if you have to translate nearly every word, no, this book it's not for you yet. So my next tip is read aloud. Okay, many booktubers are going to tell you to read a book and also listen to the audiobook. I have a very unpopular opinion on this. I think you'd rather read aloud yourself instead of listening to audiobook. Okay, in fairness, I'm saying this because I don't listen to audiobooks. It's hard for me to perceive them because, well, the deal is that my ears belong to music and to a lesser extent to podcasts, and if I have to listen to something, I'd rather listen to these, to music and podcasts. I'm not saying no to audiobooks, but my priorities are music and podcasts. And in general, I like reading book by myself. And reading aloud helps. Well, for example, when I was reading Beren and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien in English, at first I was confused, but reading aloud helped me a lot. Sure, when you will be reading aloud, your accent is going to be exposed, especially when you are going to read unfamiliar words. Well, at least that's what happened to me. When I was reading Beren and Luthien aloud, my accent became very Russian, very much. But still, it's a good tip. Read aloud. My next tip is to try selecting books that were written in modern era. Okay, so I read Francis Hodgson Burnett, J.R.R. Tolkien, John Milton, and J.M. Barrie in English, and the three of those authors wrote their books at the beginning of the last century, and Milton wrote even earlier, and they're going to have this specific language in their books. Well, Tolkien and Milton, they have this, the Old English. Well, for example, instead of you, they have thou, and instead of shall, they have shalt, and things like that. It's going to be a little bit hard to perceive, and even if the writers were simply from the past century, around the same time as Tolkien, who did not use the Old English, it's still going to be a little bit hard to perceive their language. I did not expect J.M. Barrie's text to be a little bit hard for me. Sure, it was easier than Tolkien and Milton, but it was still hard. On the other hand, the modern books, they are more accessible to modern reader, and modern reader is going to understand what things are about. I do not recommend Stephen King though. I read Stephen King in English, and although he is closer to our times, he still has a specific language, which is going to be, well, a little bit complex. Still easier though. In short, the moderner the author, the easier it's going to be for you to understand what they write about. My next tip, read it in English after you have read it in your native language. I'm sure that any book, even if it's hard for you to read, it's going to be easier to read after you have read it in your native language, and not just once. Well, for example, for me, it's kind of hard to read Lord of the Rings in English, but at least I read those books in Russian twice, and therefore I have some kind of understanding of what's going on. Another book I read after reading in Russian is The Handmaid's Tale. With The Name of the Wind, on the other hand, was the other way around. I liked the book so much after I read it in English, I decided to read it again in Russian. Yeah, this is the first time when I read the book in Russian from English. Not because it was hard, but because I loved the book. Yeah, the book is going to be easier to perceive if you had read it already in your native language. And my last tip, make sure the book you are reading is originally written in English. Here's my example. Back in 2017, I was enrolled in a university on an English language faculty. Yes, I studied in English. For this reason, I decided to work on my English skills, to read a lot in English, and then I purchased this book, A Girl in Exile by Ismail Kadare. I remember nothing of it except that the girls were watched, there was a writer in the story. I only bought the book just to improve my English skills. The book wasn't easy for me to read. At first I thought that it was because my English skills weren't that great as they are now, but then a few years later, I realized that the book was translated from Albanian. And for some reason, books translated from other languages into English, they seem a little bit odd for me. At least that one seemed. Sure, I'm not saying that all books translated into English are badly translated, not at all, but there was something off-putting about that one. I also remember back in 2019 when this Vanguardian Twilight Orchestra album came out, The Legacy of the Dark Lands. It was tied to this book called The Dark Lands by Markus Heitz. The author is German and the book was translated from German to English on Kindle. I found that book, read a few pages. I hated it because I felt like it was translated by Google Translate and it was translated awfully. And then I thought, if I'm going to read a Google translated book, I'd rather read in Russian than in English. And no, I did not find the Russian translation translation, even the poor one. In general, if a book isn't originally written in English, I prefer to buy it in Russian, but in recent years there were books I really wanted to read, therefore I got them in English because there was no Russian translation. But since I'm already an advanced reader, it isn't a problem for me anymore. I simply want to read the book. And that's all. Now here are some book recommendations for those who want to read in English. I do recommend reading Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Definitely easy to read. The whole book is an interview. Yes, it definitely reads like one huge interview. I did recommend reading articles, and articles are easier to perceive, therefore it's going to be easy for you. Speaking of rock stars, I definitely recommend reading The Rock Star's Guide to Life. These are quotes by various rock stars about life and things like that. They are quite easy to read, and it's very floppy too. As you can see, there are no long descriptions or whatever. It's an easy read. And the last book about rock stars is A History of Heavy Metal by Andrew O'Neill. This isn't just a rockstar story, this is the biography of such a deep and developed genre as heavy metal, about the subgenres and things like that. And it's quite easy to perceive, especially if you are already familiar with some history of heavy metal. The author, as far as I know, is a comedian, therefore this book is very funny, informative and funny at the same time, and it isn't very big. This book is less than 300 pages. It's going to be easy to read. And of course, I'm going to recommend you reading Harry Potter, at least the first two books. The books have an accessible language, and there's a lot of humor in the books. Already the first line sounds very funny, and it makes you want to read this book. Allow me to read it to you. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Yeah, definitely iconic. I haven't read the rest of the books, but the first two are definitely easy to perceive. Well, speaking of J.K. Rowling, there is another book I'd recommend, and it's The Ickabog. It's one of her recent books, and this edition has one bonus to it. It has a very large font and quite a short chapters too. For this video, I decided not to recommend you graphic novels or comic books, but I still decided to include The Diary of a Wimpy Kid by Jeff Kinney. This book is half comic book, half regular book. It's a very fun to read, especially if you're a teenager. My private tutor got this to me when she went to America. I was 14 at the time, and my English skills were so weaker than now, and I managed to read this. Very easy to perceive. And finally, the last book. Sure, this is a little bit of cheating because I did not fully read it in English. However, I saw the English version. I went through it and understood that the language is very easy to perceive. The book is The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. The author's writing style is very easy, very simplistic, but at the same time is also not banal at all. The author knows his way with words. Kind of ironic since this book is about the power of words. And the sentences are definitely accessible to a reader, I'd say. And therefore it's going to be easy to you, even though the book is around 500 pages long. And that's all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. What's your native language? What books would you recommend? What's your English level? Let me know down in the comments. See you next time. Goodbye.